I married a man I had never truly seen. On the night I fled Greystone Manor, I realized I had pledged my life to a shadow wearing my husband's face. The wedding had taken place on a grey October afternoon in London, beneath the vaulted ceiling of St. Margaret's Chapel, where the light filtered through stained glass like watercolor bleeding into parchment. I remember the cold press of the ring against my finger, the murmured vows that felt like stones dropping into a well with no bottom, the scent of lilies so thick it made my head swim. I was 22 years old. I wore my mother's ivory gown, altered to fit my smaller frame, and carried white roses that trembled in my hands. My father had died the previous winter, leaving behind debts and a crumbling estate in Sussex. The marriage to the Duke of Greystone was not a love match. It was a rescue, a transaction dressed in lace and orange blossom. I had met Julian Blackwood, the Duke of Greystone, only 3 times before our wedding day. Once at a ball in May, where he asked me to dance and said almost nothing for the entire waltz. Once at a garden party in June, where we walked briefly among the roses and he spoke only of the weather. And once in my guardian's drawing room in August, where the marriage settlement was signed, and he looked at me as though I were a painting he had purchased sight unseen. He was handsome in the way old portraits are handsome, all sharp lines and aristocratic distance, tall, dark-haired, with eyes the color of slate in winter. His voice was low and carefully measured, as though he weighed every word before releasing it into the world. He was 31 years old, a widower, and the master of an estate in Derbyshire that was said to be as beautiful as it was remote. I knew almost nothing about him, only what the gossip sheets whispered, and what my aunt, who had arranged the match, told me in hurried, relieved tones. He was wealthy. He was reclusive. His first wife had died in childbirth 5 years prior, along with the infant. He rarely came to London. He had no interest in society, in politics, in the theatre or the season. He spent his time at Greystone Manor, managing his lands and, it was rumored, conducting scientific experiments in the old east wing of the house. My aunt said he was eccentric, but honorable. She said I was fortunate. She said I should be grateful. And I was grateful. Or I told myself I was. Because the alternative to marriage was genteel poverty, a slow fade into irrelevance, perhaps a position as a governess or a companion to some wealthy dowager who would treat me with the particular cruelty reserved for women who have fallen from grace. So I said yes. I wore the gown. I signed the papers. I became the Duchess of Greystone in a ceremony that felt more like a funeral than a beginning. The wedding breakfast was held at my guardian's townhouse, a modest affair with perhaps 30 guests, most of them distant relatives or business associates of the Duke. I sat beside my husband at the head of the table and tried to eat while he spoke quietly with the gentleman on his other side about railway shares and land management. He did not look at me. He did not touch me. When the toasts were given, he raised his glass and nodded politely, but his eyes were somewhere else, focused on a point beyond the room, beyond the moment. I wondered if he was thinking of his first wife. I wondered if he regretted this marriage as much as I feared it. By late afternoon, we were in the Duke's carriage, bound for Greystone Manor. The journey would take 2 days. We would spend the first night at an inn along the road, and the second night we would arrive at the estate. I sat across from my husband in the dim interior of the carriage, my hands folded in my lap, my heart beating too fast. The countryside rolled past the window in shades of gold and rust, the autumn fields harvested and bare. Julian read a book, or pretended to. I watched the light change. Neither of us spoke. The inn was called the White Hart, a respectable establishment on the main road north. We were given the best room, a suite with a sitting area and a large 4-poster bed draped in dark green velvet. A fire had been lit in the grate. Supper was brought up on trays. I picked at roasted chicken and potatoes while Julian stood by the window, looking out at the darkening yard. When the maid came to clear the dishes, he told her we were not to be disturbed. Then he turned to me and said, in that careful, measured voice, that I should rest, that the journey had been long, that we would speak in the morning. I did not know what to say. I nodded. I retreated to the small dressing room adjoining the suite and changed into my nightgown with shaking hands. My aunt had prepared me, in vague and embarrassed terms, for what would happen on my wedding night. But as the hours passed and Julian remained in the sitting room, the fire burning low, I began to understand that nothing would happen. Not tonight. Perhaps not ever. I did not know whether to feel relieved or insulted. I lay awake in the great bed, listening to the creak of floorboards, the distant sound of horses in the stable, the whisper of wind against the windows, and eventually, I slept. We reached Greystone Manor the following evening, just as the last light was draining from the sky. The house rose out of the mist like something from a dream or a nightmare. It was vast, built of gray stone that seemed to absorb the dusk, with towers and gables and rows of mullioned windows that reflected nothing. The grounds were wild, the garden overgrown, the trees twisted and ancient. A long gravel drive curved through parkland dotted with sheep, and as we approached, I saw the outline of a chapel in the distance, half hidden by yew trees. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, and something else, something faintly metallic that I could not name. Julian helped me down from the carriage, his hand cold even through my glove. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Garrick, greeted us at the door and led us through a series of dim corridors to the main hall, where a fire had been lit and supper was waiting. The house was silent, oppressively so, as though it were holding its breath. I saw no other servants, heard no voices, only the echo of our footsteps on the stone floors. Mrs. Garrick showed me to my rooms, a suite in the west wing that overlooked the gardens. She told me that the Duke's chambers were in the east wing, across the house. She told me that breakfast was served at 8. She told me that if I needed anything, I should ring. And then she left, and I was alone. I stood in the center of the room, still wearing my traveling cloak, and looked around. The furniture was old and heavy, the drapes a faded wine red, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and lavender. There was a writing desk by the window, a wardrobe against one wall, a small sitting area with 2 chairs arranged before the fireplace. The bed was enormous, carved from dark wood, with a canopy of embroidered fabric that looked as though it had not been changed in decades. I felt very small, very far from home, very much like a stranger in a house that did not want me. I do not know how long I stood there. Eventually, I removed my cloak and my traveling dress and put on a simpler gown, something warm and modest. I braided my hair. I tried to read a book I had brought with me, but the words slid past without meaning. I paced. I looked out the window at the darkening grounds and saw nothing but mist and shadow. And then, because I could not bear the silence any longer, I decided to explore. The corridors of Greystone Manor were labyrinthine, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense, as though the house had been built in stages over centuries and no one had bothered to impose order. I walked slowly, trailing my hand along the wall, passing closed doors and empty rooms and portraits of long-dead Blackwoods who stared down at me with disapproval. I descended a staircase and found myself in a gallery lined with windows that looked out over the gardens. The moon had risen, pale and cold, and in its light I could see the shapes of statues, the outline of a fountain, the dark mass of hedges, and then I saw him, Julian, my husband, walking alone across the lawn, his hands in his pockets, his head bowed. He moved slowly, as though lost in thought, and I watched him pass beneath the trees and disappear into the shadows near the chapel. I felt a strange pang of something I could not name, loneliness, perhaps, or recognition. Here was a man as isolated as I was, wandering his own grounds like a ghost. I turned away from the window and continued walking. I passed through a music room, the pianoforte shrouded in dust, and a library that smelled of old leather and pipe smoke. I climbed another staircase and found myself in a narrower hallway, darker and colder than the others. At the end of the hall was a door, slightly ajar, with light spilling through the crack. I hesitated. I knew I should return to my room. I knew I was intruding, but curiosity, that terrible human weakness, drew me forward. I pushed the door open. The room beyond was a study, or perhaps a laboratory. There were shelves lined with books and glass jars filled with strange specimens, tables covered with instruments I did not recognize, coils of copper wire, lenses, mirrors arranged at odd angles. The air smelled of chemicals, sharp and acrid. And in the center of the room, bent over a large wooden apparatus that looked like a camera but was not quite a camera, was Julian, or a man who looked exactly like Julian. He wore the same dark coat, the same white shirt, the same expression of intense concentration. But something was wrong. The light was wrong. The shadows were wrong. He moved with a strange, jerky quality, as though he were a reflection caught in water. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat, and he looked up. For a moment, our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Not recognition, not surprise, but a kind of desperate, pleading sorrow that made my blood run cold. And then he was gone, not walked away, not turned aside, simply gone, as though he had never been there at all. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty. The apparatus sat silent and still. The mirrors reflected nothing but shadows. I backed away, my hands shaking, and stumbled into the hallway. I ran. I did not think. I simply ran, back through the corridors, down the stairs, through the gallery, until I reached the main hall and nearly collided with Mrs. Garrick, who was carrying a candle. She steadied me with a firm hand and looked at me with something between concern and irritation. She asked if I was unwell, if I needed anything. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell her what I had seen, but the words would not come. Because what had I seen? A man who looked like my husband in a room that should not have been occupied? A trick of light and shadow and exhaustion? I did not know. I could not say. I told her I was tired, that I had lost my way. She nodded and escorted me back to my rooms, her expression unreadable. She told me to rest. She told me that Greystone Manor took some getting used to. She told me, in a tone that suggested this was not advice but a warning, that it was best not to wander at night. I locked the door behind her. I stood in the center of the room, trembling, and tried to make sense of what had happened. But there was no sense to be made. I had seen Julian walking in the garden. I had seen him, or something that looked like him, in the East Wing laboratory. 2 places at once. Impossible. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, and watched the grounds. The mist thickened. The moon set. And in the hours before dawn, I saw him again. Julian, standing beneath the trees near the chapel, perfectly still, as though he were waiting for something, or someone. When morning came, I was pale and hollow-eyed. I dressed with care, forcing my hands to steady, and went down to breakfast. Julian was already there, seated at the head of the table, reading a newspaper. He looked up when I entered and rose politely, pulling out a chair for me. He asked if I had slept well. His voice was the same as always, calm, measured, distant. I lied. I said yes. He poured tea for me and returned to his newspaper. We ate in silence. I watched him carefully, searching for some sign, some flicker of the sorrow I had seen in the laboratory. But there was nothing. He was composed, unremarkable, entirely himself. And yet, as I looked at him, I felt the first cold touch of real fear. Because if what I had seen was real, if my husband could be in 2 places at once, then I had not married a man at all. I had married something else, something impossible, something that defied every law of nature I had ever known. And if what I had seen was not real, if my mind had fractured under the weight of fear and loneliness and this strange, oppressive house, then I was losing myself. And I did not know which possibility terrified me more. 3 nights I endured it. 3 nights of wandering the corridors, searching for answers, seeing him in the gardens and the laboratory and the chapel, always alone, always silent, always just out of reach. 3 nights of lying awake, listening to footsteps that might have been his, or might have been echoes of my own fear. 3 nights of sitting across from him at breakfast and supper, trying to reconcile the man before me with the shadow I had seen, trying to find the words to ask what was happening. But I could not ask, because to ask would be to admit that I did not understand, that I was afraid, that I was already regretting the choice I had made. On the 4th night, I made my decision. I packed a small bag with a few clothes, what little money I had, and the locket my mother had given me. I waited until the house was silent, until the last candle had been extinguished and the servants had retired. And then I slipped out of my room, down the servants' stairs, and out through the kitchen door into the night. The air was cold and damp, the mist so thick I could barely see the path. I walked quickly, my cloak pulled tight around me, my heart pounding in my ears. I did not look back. I did not let myself think about what I was doing, about the scandal, about the shame, about the fact that I was abandoning my husband on the 4th night of our marriage without explanation or farewell. I only knew that I could not stay. Not in that house. Not with that man or that thing wearing his face. I reached the main road as dawn was breaking, the sky turning pale and colorless. A farmer's cart came along, heading south, and I begged for a ride. The farmer looked at me with suspicion, at my fine cloak and my wild eyes, but he let me climb into the back among the sacks of grain. We rode in silence. I did not tell him who I was. I did not tell him where I was going. I only knew that I was fleeing, and that I would never return to Greystone Manor, not if I could help it, not even if he came looking for me. I found refuge with my Aunt Catherine in a small market town in Shropshire, a place so unremarkable that I hoped even scandal could not find me there. She did not ask many questions when I arrived on her doorstep, pale and trembling, with only a traveling bag and a story about needing time away from my new marriage. She simply took me in, gave me a room overlooking her narrow garden, and made me tea with hands that shook almost as much as mine. Aunt Catherine was my father's eldest sister, a spinster who had never married and who lived on a modest income in a cottage that smelled of lavender and old books. She was nearly 60, thin as a rail, with silver hair she wore in a strict bun and eyes that missed very little. She had not approved of my marriage to the Duke. She had said, when the engagement was announced, that a man who buried himself in the countryside and conducted experiments in the dark was not the sort of man a young woman should bind herself to. But she had also said that I had little choice in the matter, given my circumstances. And so she had kept her peace and attended the wedding with a tight smile and a sense of foreboding that, it turned out, was entirely justified. Now, as I sat in her small parlor and tried to explain why I had left Greystone Manor after only 4 days of marriage, I found that I could not tell her the truth. How could I? How could I say that I had seen my husband in 2 places at once, that I had witnessed something that defied all reason and natural law, that I had fled not because he was cruel or unkind, but because I feared he was not entirely human? She would think me mad. She would send for a doctor. She would write to Julian and tell him that his bride had lost her senses. And so I lied. I told her that the marriage had been a mistake, that Julian and I were incompatible, that the house was too isolated, too cold, too strange, that I needed time to think, to decide what I wanted. She listened with a grave expression and did not press me for details. She only said that I could stay as long as I needed, that she would tell no one I was there, that whatever had happened, I was safe now. But I was not safe, not truly, because even in that quiet cottage, in that unremarkable town, I could not escape the memory of what I had seen. At night, I dreamed of the laboratory, of the figure bent over the strange apparatus, of the desperate sorrow in his eyes. I dreamed of Julian standing beneath the trees, waiting. I dreamed of mirrors and shadows and faces that flickered and changed, and I woke gasping, my heart racing, convinced that he was in the room with me, watching. During the day, I tried to make myself useful. I helped Aunt Catherine with her correspondence, wrote letters for her to distant cousins and old friends, accompanied her to the village shops where we bought bread and cheese and candles. I read novels from her small library, books by Mrs. Radcliffe and Wilkie Collins that seemed suddenly too real, too close to my own situation. I walked in the garden and tried to find peace in the simplicity of it, the rows of vegetables, the late roses clinging to life, the beehive humming in the corner. But peace eluded me, because with each passing day, the weight of what I had done grew heavier. I had abandoned my husband. I had broken my vows. I had brought shame not only on myself, but on my family, on my aunt, on the memory of my parents. The marriage had been legal and binding. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of God, in the eyes of society, I was the Duchess of Greystone, and I had run away like a frightened child. The gossip reached us within a week. A letter arrived for Aunt Catherine from a cousin in London, full of breathless scandal and thinly veiled curiosity. The new Duchess of Greystone had fled her husband's estate after only 4 nights of marriage. No one knew why. Some said the Duke had been cruel. Others said the bride had been hysterical, unfit for marriage, perhaps even unhinged. There were whispers that the Duke was searching for her, that he had sent men to London, to Sussex, to every coaching inn along the road, that he was offering a reward for information about her whereabouts. Aunt Catherine read the letter aloud to me in a flat, disapproving tone, and then folded it carefully and set it aside. She looked at me over her spectacles and said that I had made my bed and now I would have to lie in it. That scandal was a difficult thing to outrun, that if I did not return to Greystone Manor soon, my reputation would be destroyed beyond repair, that no one would receive me, that I would be cut off from society entirely. I told her I did not care about society. She said that I should, that a woman alone, without a husband, without money, without position, was nothing in this world, that I was lucky to have a roof over my head at all. I knew she was right, and yet I could not bring myself to go back. Every time I thought of Greystone Manor, of those dim corridors and that oppressive silence, of the figure in the laboratory who was and was not my husband, I felt a cold panic rising in my chest. I could not explain it. I could not justify it. I only knew that I would rather face poverty and disgrace than return to that place. And so the weeks passed. Autumn deepened into winter. The days grew shorter and colder. I helped Aunt Catherine prepare for the season, preserving fruit, mending linens, knitting stockings by the fire. We spoke little. She had withdrawn into a kind of resigned disappointment, treating me with the polite distance one might show a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. I could not blame her. I had brought trouble to her door. I had made her complicit in my scandal. In early November, a letter arrived addressed to me. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper heavy and expensive. Aunt Catherine brought it to me in the parlor, her expression unreadable, and left me alone to open it. My hands shook as I broke the seal. It was from Julian. The letter was brief, written in a careful, even hand that revealed nothing of emotion or urgency. He wrote that he hoped I was well, that he understood I had left Greystone Manor suddenly, and that he did not blame me for it, that the house was difficult, that he himself found it oppressive at times, that he should have prepared me better for what to expect. He wrote that he would like to speak with me, if I were willing, that he would come to me wherever I was, or that I could meet him in a neutral location, that he owed me an explanation, that there were things he should have told me before we married, things he had been afraid to reveal. He signed it simply, Julian. I read the letter 3 times, searching for some hidden meaning, some threat or manipulation. But there was none. The tone was restrained, almost humble. He was not demanding that I return. He was not angry. He was asking, pleading even, in his own quiet way. I did not know what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore the letter, to burn it and pretend I had never received it. Part of me wanted to write back and demand answers. What had I seen in the laboratory? Why had he been in 2 places at once? What kind of man, or what kind of thing, had I married? But another part of me, a part I did not want to acknowledge, felt a strange pull toward him, a curiosity, a longing almost, to understand, because despite everything, despite the fear and the confusion and the impossibility of what I had witnessed, I could not forget the sorrow I had seen in his eyes, the desperate, pleading sorrow that suggested he was as trapped as I was, that he too was suffering. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer of my writing desk. I did not reply. Not yet. I needed time to think, to decide what I wanted, to understand my own heart. 2 days later, a second letter arrived. This one was from Mrs. Garrick, the housekeeper at Greystone Manor. Her tone was formal and cool, but beneath the formality, I sensed something else. Concern, perhaps, or pity. She wrote that the Duke had been unwell since my departure, that he spent long hours alone in the East Wing, refusing meals, refusing visitors, working on his experiments with a kind of feverish intensity that frightened the staff, that he had dismissed most of the servants, keeping only herself and a single footman, that the house was falling into disrepair, the fires left unlit, the curtains drawn, the silence so complete that it felt like a tomb. She wrote that she did not know what had passed between us, but that she believed the Duke was a good man, that he was troubled, yes, but not dangerous, that whatever I had seen or heard or feared, There was likely an explanation, that he deserved a chance to explain himself. She concluded by saying that if I did not return soon, she feared what might become of him. And, she added, what might become of me, because a woman who abandoned her husband without cause would find no mercy in the world, no matter how justified her reasons might seem to her own heart. I set the letter aside and stared out the window at the gray November sky. Rain dripped from the eaves. The garden was bare and brown, the roses dead, the bees silent in their hive. I felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a physical thing, crushing the air from my lungs. If I went back, I would have to face whatever truth lay hidden in Greystone Manor. I would have to confront Julian. I would have to look into his eyes and demand answers. And I would have to accept that what I had seen might not have been madness or illusion, but something real. Something that challenged everything I believed about the world. If I did not go back, I would spend the rest of my life running, hiding, living on the charity of relatives who resented me in towns where no one knew my name, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering. I would never have answers. I would never have peace. And I would never know if the man I had married was worth saving, or if he had been lost long before I ever met him. That night, I wrote a letter to Julian. It was short, carefully worded, neither warm nor cold. I wrote that I would meet him, not at Greystone Manor, but in a town halfway between, a place called Ashford, where there was a respectable inn and a railway station. I wrote that I would come alone, that I expected honesty from him, that if he could not give me the truth, then there was no point in meeting at all. I posted the letter the next morning and waited. The reply came within 3 days. Julian agreed to my terms. He would meet me at the King's Arms in Ashford on the 15th of November at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He thanked me. He wrote that he hoped I would find it in my heart to listen to what he had to say, that he understood if I could not forgive him, but that he had to try. The 15th of November was a cold, clear day, the sky a hard blue, the wind sharp with the promise of snow. I dressed carefully in a traveling suit of dark gray wool, my hair pinned severely beneath a small hat, my gloves buttoned tight. Aunt Catherine watched me prepare with a disapproving frown, but said nothing. She had made her opinion clear. She thought I was a fool for going, that I should either return to my husband properly, with humility and obedience, or cut all ties and accept the consequences, that this half measure, this meeting in a neutral town, would solve nothing. Perhaps she was right, but I had to know. I had to hear what Julian would say. I had to look into his face and decide, once and for all, whether I had married a man or a ghost. The journey to Ashford took most of the day. I traveled by coach, alone, my small bag on the seat beside me. The landscape rolled past, fields and hedgerows and villages huddled around church spires. I did not read. I did not sleep. I simply watched the world go by and tried to calm the frantic beating of my heart. The King's Arms was a large, respectable inn near the center of town, the kind of place where travelers stopped for a meal or a night's rest before continuing on their journeys. The public rooms were warm and busy, full of the smell of roasting meat and the hum of conversation. The innkeeper showed me to a private parlor on the first floor, a small room with a fire burning in the grate and a table set for tea. He told me that the Duke had not yet arrived, but was expected shortly. I thanked him and sat down to wait. The minutes stretched. I stared into the fire and tried to rehearse what I would say. But every time I formed the words in my mind, they dissolved into incoherence. How did one ask a man if he was real? How did one demand an explanation for the impossible? At precisely 2 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. My breath caught. The door opened, and Julian stepped into the room. He looked thinner than I remembered, his face drawn and pale, shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worry. He wore a dark coat and a simple waistcoat, his hair slightly disheveled, as though he had traveled in haste. He stopped just inside the doorway and looked at me with an expression I could not read. Relief, perhaps, or fear, or something deeper, something raw and unguarded that I had never seen in him before. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We simply looked at each other across the small room. Two people who had made vows and broken them, who had shared a name but not a life, who were bound by law and separated by mystery. And then he said, very quietly, Eleanor. Just my name. But the way he said it, with such careful tenderness, such aching uncertainty, made something inside me crack. I realized, in that moment, that I had been holding myself together through sheer force of will. And now, hearing my name spoken like that, like a prayer or a plea, I felt the first tremor of the collapse I had been fighting for weeks. I stood up. I meant to be strong, to be cold, to demand answers immediately. But instead, I found myself saying, in a voice that shook, "Why were you in two places at once?" He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were full of sorrow. The same sorrow I had seen in the laboratory. The same desperate, pleading sorrow that had haunted my dreams. He said, "Please, sit down, let me explain." And because I had come all this way, because I had agreed to this meeting, because some part of me still wanted to believe that there was a rational explanation for what I had seen, I sat down, and I waited for my husband to tell me the truth. Julian did not sit. He stood by the window, his back half turned to me, his hands clasped behind him in a posture that suggested both restraint and defeat. The firelight played across his profile, casting shadows that made him look older, more weary than his 31 years. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low I had to lean forward to hear him. He said, "I had a brother, a twin. His name was Thomas." I said nothing. I waited. Outside, the sounds of the inn continued, muffled and distant. The clink of glasses, the murmur of voices, the ordinary world carrying on while mine tilted and rearranged itself. Julian continued. We were identical in every way. Same face, same voice, same gestures. People who did not know us well could never tell us apart. Even our own mother sometimes confused us when we were children. But we were not the same, Eleanor. Not in temperament, not in spirit. Thomas was everything I was not. He was warm where I was reserved. He was charming where I was awkward. He loved people, loved society, loved life. He should have been the Duke. He would have been better at it than I ever was. He paused, his jaw tight, and I saw him swallow hard before continuing. When we were 23, Thomas fell ill. It began as a cough, nothing serious, or so we thought. But it worsened. Within 6 months, he was bedridden. The doctors said it was consumption, that there was no cure, that we should prepare for the end. I refused to accept it. I could not. He was my brother, my twin. We had come into this world together. I could not imagine existing without him. Julian turned to face me then, and the anguish in his eyes was so raw, so unguarded, that I felt my breath catch. This was not the distant, careful man I had married. This was someone broken open, bleeding out the grief he had carried for years. I was studying at Cambridge at the time, he said. Natural philosophy, physics, optics. I had always been interested in light, in how it behaves, how it can be captured and bent and preserved. There were experiments being conducted, radical theories about photography, about using chemicals and glass to freeze a moment in time, to make it permanent. I became obsessed with the idea. If we could capture light, if we could preserve an image, then perhaps we could preserve something more, something essential. He crossed to the table and sat down heavily in the chair opposite me. His hands trembled slightly as he folded them on the table. I noticed for the first time how thin he had become, how the bones of his wrists stood out against his skin. I brought Thomas home to Greystone Manor, he said. I set up a laboratory in the East Wing. I worked day and night, barely sleeping, barely eating. I convinced myself that if I could just find the right combination of mirrors and lenses, and light, if I could capture not just his image, but his essence, his consciousness, his soul, then I could save him. I could make him immortal. My heart was pounding now. I thought of the apparatus I had seen in the laboratory, the strange arrangement of mirrors and glass and copper wire. I thought of the figure bent over it, the desperate sorrow in his eyes. I whispered, "What did you do?" Julian looked at me, and in his gaze I saw shame and grief and a kind of terrible, helpless love. "I built a machine," he said. "I called it a vitoscope. It used a series of mirrors arranged at precise angles, combined with a chemical process I had developed, to capture and project light in a way that had never been done before. The theory was that if I could capture the light reflected from a living person, I could preserve their likeness with such fidelity that it would be indistinguishable from the person themselves. Not just a photograph, but something more. Something that seemed to move, to breathe, to exist. I felt cold, so cold. The fire in the grate seemed to give no warmth at all. I asked, "And Thomas?" He let me try. Julian's voice cracked. He was dying. He knew it, and he loved me. He wanted to help me. So he sat for me hour after hour while I adjusted the mirrors and mixed the chemicals and captured his image over and over again. And then, 2 weeks before you and I were married, he died, in his sleep, quietly, with me beside him. Tears were sliding down Julian's face now, silent and unchecked. He made no move to wipe them away. He simply sat there, broken, and let them fall. "I buried him in the family chapel," he said, "and I returned to the laboratory, because I could not let him go. I could not accept that he was gone. I activated the vitascope, and Eleanor, God help me, it worked. Not in the way I had hoped, not in any way that made sense, but it worked. The mirrors caught the light, the chemicals reacted, and suddenly there he was, Thomas, standing in the room, looking at me. As real as you are now, I could not breathe. I could not move. I could only stare at him and try to comprehend what he was saying. "It is not Thomas," Julian continued, his voice breaking. "I know that. It is not his soul, not his consciousness. It is an echo, a projection, a trick of light and chemistry and grief. But Eleanor, it looks like him. It moves like him. And sometimes, late at night, when I am alone in the laboratory and I activate the machine, I can almost believe that he is still with me, that I did not fail him, that some part of him remains." He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shook, and I sat there, frozen, as the full horror and tragedy of what he had done became clear to me. The man I had seen in the laboratory had not been Julian. It had been Thomas. Or rather, it had been the image of Thomas, captured and preserved and projected through Julian's impossible machine. A ghost made of light and mirrors and desperate love. I rose from my chair and went to him. I did not think. I simply moved, crossing the small distance between us, and knelt beside him. I reached out and took his hands, pulling them gently away from his face. His eyes were red, his cheeks wet. He looked at me with such raw vulnerability that it made my chest ache. I said softly, "Julian, I saw you in the garden, that same night. You were walking outside while the projection was in the laboratory. You were in 2 places at once." He nodded slowly. "That was me," he said. "The real me. I often walk the grounds at night when I cannot sleep. I did not know you had seen me. I did not know you had found the laboratory. I thought I had been careful. I thought I had kept it hidden. But I did find it," I said, "and I saw Thomas. Or I saw what you created. And I was so frightened, Julian. I did not understand. I thought you were some kind of specter, some impossible thing. I thought I had married something that was not human." He closed his eyes, fresh tears spilling over. "I am so sorry," he whispered. "I should have told you before we married. I should have explained everything. But I was afraid that you would think me mad, afraid that you would refuse the marriage, afraid that I would be alone with this terrible secret forever." I tightened my grip on his hands. "Why did you marry me at all?" I asked. "If you were so consumed by grief, if you were spending all your time with this machine, why seek a wife?" His eyes opened, and he looked at me with an intensity that made my heart stutter. "Because I was drowning," he said. "Because I knew that if I did not find a way to rejoin the living world, I would spend the rest of my life in that laboratory, chasing a shadow. My aunt arranged the marriage. She said I needed stability, a companion, someone to bring light back into my life. And when I met you, Eleanor, when I saw you for the first time at that ball, I thought perhaps she was right. You were so alive, so present, so real. Everything Thomas's projection was not." He reached up and touched my face, his fingers trembling. "I wanted to be worthy of you," he said. "I wanted to put the machine aside, to let Thomas go, to be the husband you deserved. But I could not. Not yet. And when you found the laboratory, When you saw what I had created, I knew I had lost you. I knew you would run, and I did not blame you. I still do not blame you. I felt tears burning in my own eyes now. I had not cried since leaving Greystone Manor. I had held myself together through sheer will, refusing to break, refusing to show weakness. But now, kneeling on the floor of this small parlor, holding the hands of a man whose grief had driven him to create the impossible, I felt the walls I had built around myself begin to crumble. I said, "Is it still there? The projection? The machine?" He nodded. "I cannot bring myself to destroy it," he said. "I know I should. I know it is not healthy. But Eleanor, he was my brother, my twin, my other half, and I failed him. I could not save him. The machine is all I have left." I understood then. Not fully, perhaps, but enough. Julian was not a monster. He was not inhuman. He was simply a man who had loved his brother so much that he had torn a hole in the fabric of reality, trying to keep him. A man whose brilliance and desperation had led him to create something that should not exist. A man who was trapped between the living and the dead, unable to move forward, unable to let go. I said, "You did not fail him, Julian. You could not have saved him. Consumption has no cure. You know that." He shook his head. "I should have been with him more at the end. I should have held his hand and told him I loved him instead of hiding in the laboratory, trying to cheat death. I was selfish. I was a coward." "No," I said firmly. "You were grieving. You were trying to do the impossible out of love. That is not cowardice. That is devotion." He looked at me as though I had said something incomprehensible, as though kindness was a language he no longer understood. And perhaps it was. Perhaps he had been alone with his guilt and grief for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, to be understood, to be forgiven. I asked, "Does anyone else know about the machine?" "Only Mrs. Garrick," he said. "She helped me care for Thomas in his final days. She knows I built something in the laboratory. She has seen the projection once or twice, but she does not understand the science of it. She thinks it is witchcraft. She has begged me to destroy it. She says it is unnatural, that it will drive me mad." "And will it?" I asked quietly. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I do not know. Sometimes I think it already has." I rose to my feet and pulled him up with me. We stood facing each other, his hands still in mine, the fire crackling softly behind us. I said, "Julian, I want to see it. The machine, the projection. I want to understand." He stared at me. "You want to return to Greystone Manor?" "Yes," I said. "Not because I have forgiven you. Not because I am ready to resume our marriage as though nothing happened. But because I need to see the truth for myself. I need to understand what you have created, and I need to help you decide what to do with it." He searched my face, his expression a mixture of hope and fear and disbelief. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you help me?" "Because," I said slowly, "I think I understand what it means to be haunted. I think I understand what it means to be trapped by something you cannot escape. And I think, Julian, that you and I are more alike than I realized. We are both running from ghosts. The only difference is that yours are made of light and mine are made of memory." He pulled me close then, not as a husband claims a wife, but as a drowning man reaches for something solid. He wrapped his arms around me and held me tight, his face pressed against my hair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I felt his heart beating against mine, frantic and desperate and alive. And I held him back, because whatever else he was, whatever he had done, he was not a monster. He was a man in pain. And pain, I was beginning to understand, could drive any of us to impossible acts. We left Ashford the following morning, traveling together to Greystone Manor in Julian's carriage. The journey was quiet but not uncomfortable. We sat across from each other, and occasionally he would look at me as though checking to make sure I had not vanished. I looked back and tried to see him clearly, not as the distant duke I had married, not as the frightening figure I had fled, but as Julian, a man with a brilliant mind and a broken heart, a man who had loved his brother so much that he had tried to bring him back from the dead. The countryside rolled past, gray and bare under a heavy sky. By afternoon, we were approaching the estate, and as Greystone Manor came into view, rising out of the mist like something from a fever dream. I felt not fear this time, but a strange sense of purpose. I had come back to face the impossible, to stand in that laboratory and look at what Julian had created, to decide, once and for all, whether love and science could coexist, or whether some doors, once opened, should never have been touched at all. Mrs. Garrick met us at the door. Her expression when she saw me was one of surprise and, I thought, relief. She said nothing, only nodded and took my cloak. The house was as cold and silent as I remembered, but somehow less frightening. Perhaps because I understood it now. Perhaps because I was not alone. Julian led me through the corridors to the east wing. We climbed the narrow staircase and stopped before the door I had opened on my wedding night. He looked at me one last time, his hand on the door handle, and said, "Are you certain?" I nodded. "I am certain." He opened the door. The laboratory was exactly as I remembered it. The shelves lined with books and specimens, the tables covered with instruments, and in the center of the room, the vitoscope. The apparatus of wood and glass and mirror, strange and beautiful and utterly wrong. Julian crossed to it and made a few adjustments. He lit a candle and placed it in a precise position. He poured a small amount of chemical solution into a glass chamber, and then he stepped back and said, "Watch." The mirrors began to catch the light. The chemical reacted, glowing faintly. And then, as I watched, breathless, a figure began to form in the air before the apparatus. It was Thomas. I knew it was Thomas because he looked exactly like Julian, but softer somehow, more open, with a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He stood there, translucent and shimmering, his edges blurred as though he were not quite solid. He did not speak. He did not move toward us. He simply stood, a frozen moment of light and loss, staring at nothing. Julian said very quietly, "Hello, Thomas." The projection did not respond. Of course it did not. It was not alive. It was not conscious. It was only light, shaped and held by mirrors and chemicals and desperate, impossible science. But it looked so real. I reached out, slowly, and my hand passed through the projection as though it were smoke. Thomas flickered but did not disappear. I pulled my hand back and looked at Julian. He was watching the projection with an expression of such profound sadness that I wanted to weep. I said, "He looks like you." Julian smiled faintly. He was the better version of me. "No," I said. "He was just a different version. And Julian, he is gone. This is not him. You know that." He closed his eyes. "I know. But Eleanor, when I stand here and look at him, I can almost pretend that I did not fail, that he is still here, that I am not alone." I took his hand. "You are not alone," I said. "Not anymore." He looked at me, his eyes bright with tears. And then, very slowly, he reached out and extinguished the candle. The projection faded. Thomas disappeared. And we stood together in the dark laboratory, surrounded by the tools of Julian's grief, and began the long, painful work of letting go. The days that followed were unlike anything I had imagined marriage would be. Julian and I inhabited Greystone Manor like two ghosts ourselves, moving carefully around each other, learning the rhythms of coexistence, building something fragile and new in the ruins of what we had begun. We did not sleep in the same room. That intimacy still felt impossible, a bridge too far for two people who barely knew each other beyond shared tragedy. But we took our meals together, breakfast in the small morning room that caught the pale winter light, supper in the dining room with its long table and heavy silence. We spoke more than we had in those first terrible days of our marriage. Julian told me about his studies at Cambridge, about his fascination with light and optics, about the way the world could be broken down into particles and waves and measured, understood, controlled. I told him about my childhood in Sussex, about my father's slow decline after my mother's death, about the loneliness of being a woman without means in a world that valued women only for their connections and their obedience. We were careful with each other, polite. But beneath the politeness, something was shifting. A recognition, perhaps. An acknowledgement that we were both wounded, both trapped, both trying to find a way forward through the dark. The vitoscope remained in the laboratory, covered with a sheet, like a body waiting for burial. Julian did not activate it. He did not visit the East Wing. He spent his days with me instead, showing me the estate, walking with me through the grounds despite the cold, sitting with me in the library while I read, and he stared into the fire. He was trying, I realized, to live in the present, to choose the living over the dead, but I could feel the pull of the machine. It was there in the way his gaze sometimes drifted toward the east wing, in the way his hands clenched when we passed the staircase that led up to the laboratory. In the restless nights when I heard his footsteps in the corridor outside my room, pacing, pausing, retreating, he was fighting a battle I could not fully understand, a war between love and grief, between the brother he had lost and the wife he was trying to claim. I did not push him. I understood, better than he perhaps realized, what it meant to hold on to something that was already gone. I had held on to my parents long after they had died, refusing to let their memory fade, building my entire identity around the fact that I was their daughter, that I carried their blood and their name and their disappointed hopes. It had taken my father's death and the loss of our estate to force me to let go, to accept that I was no longer a cherished daughter, but simply a woman alone in the world, with nothing but my own strength to rely upon. Julian needed to come to that same acceptance, but I could not force it. I could only wait, and hope that he would choose life before the machine consumed him entirely. 3 weeks after my return, on a night when the wind howled around the manor and rain lashed against the windows, Julian came to my room. It was late, past midnight, and I was sitting by the fire in my nightgown and wrapper, unable to sleep. When the knock came, soft and hesitant, I knew who it was before I opened the door. He stood in the hallway, still dressed, his hair disheveled, his eyes haunted. He said, "I need to show you something, please." I did not ask questions. I simply wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and followed him through the silent house, up the narrow staircase, to the laboratory. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. I followed. The room was cold, the fire in the small grate long dead. Julian lit a candle and then several lamps, filling the space with warm, flickering light. He moved to the vitascope and pulled away the sheet. The apparatus gleamed in the lamplight, brass and glass and polished wood, beautiful in its strangeness. Julian did not look at me. He simply began to prepare the machine, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of ritual. He adjusted the mirrors. He poured the chemical solution. He positioned the candle. And then he stepped back and waited. The projection formed slowly this time, as though the machine itself were reluctant. Thomas appeared in the air, shimmering and translucent, his face frozen in that gentle, distant smile. Julian stared at him, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. And then he spoke, not to me, to Thomas. He said, "I have to let you go. You know that, don't you? I have to stop this. I have to live. Eleanor is here now. She came back. She is trying to help me. And I owe it to her, to myself, to stop living in the past, to stop pretending you are still here." The projection, of course, said nothing. It simply stood there, a monument to impossible science and desperate love. Julian continued, his voice breaking. "I miss you every day, every single day. I think about what you would say, what you would do. I think about how you would have handled things better than I ever could. You were always the stronger one, the braver one, and I am sorry. I am so sorry that I could not save you. That all my intelligence, all my knowledge was useless in the face of your illness. I failed you, Thomas, and I have been punishing myself ever since." Tears were streaming down his face now. He made no attempt to hide them. He simply stood there, speaking to a ghost made of light, and let his grief pour out. "I should have been with you at the end," he said. "I should have held your hand and told you that I loved you. Instead, I was in this damned laboratory, trying to make you immortal, trying to cheat death, trying to prove that I was cleverer than God. But I was not. I am not. And you are gone. And no amount of mirrors or chemicals or desperate science can bring you back." He took a shaking breath. "I am going to destroy the machine," he said. "I am going to let you go. Because keeping you here, like this, is not honoring your memory. It is desecrating it. You would not want this. You would tell me to live, to be happy, to find love and purpose and joy. You always wanted those things for me, even when I could not want them for myself. Julian reached out toward the projection, his hand trembling. For a moment his fingers hovered near Thomas's translucent face. Then he pulled back and turned to me. His eyes were red and swollen, his expression raw. He said, "Help me." I crossed to him and took his hand. Together, we moved to the Vitascope. Julian showed me how it worked, the delicate balance of mirrors and chemicals and light. And then, slowly, methodically, we began to dismantle it. We worked through the night. We removed the mirrors and wrapped them in cloth. We emptied the chemical chambers and cleaned them with water and rags. We disconnected the copper wires and the lenses and the intricate mechanisms Julian had built with such care. Piece by piece, we took apart the machine that had held Thomas captive. Piece by piece, we set Julian free. By dawn, the Vitascope was gone. All that remained were its components, scattered across the tables like the bones of some strange creature. The projection had long since faded. Thomas was gone, truly gone now. And Julian stood in the center of the laboratory, exhausted and empty and, I thought, finally at peace. He looked at me and said, "Thank you." I said, "You did this yourself. I only helped." He shook his head. "I could not have done it alone. I have tried so many times, and I could never bring myself to even touch it. But with you here, I found the strength. You gave me that, Eleanor. You gave me a reason to choose the living." Something in his voice, in the way he looked at me, made my heart skip. This was not gratitude. Or rather, it was not only gratitude. It was something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to affection. I did not know what to say, so I simply took his hand and led him out of the laboratory. We walked together through the silent house, past the portraits of dead Blackwoods and the closed doors of empty rooms, down to the main hall where the first light of morning was beginning to filter through the windows. And there, in that cold and formal space, Julian stopped and turned to face me. He said, "I want to be a proper husband to you, if you will let me. I want to start over, to do this right, to build a marriage based not on obligation or convenience, but on honesty and respect, and perhaps, in time, something more." I looked at him, at this man who had created the impossible out of love, who had carried his grief like a stone around his neck, who had been brave enough to let go, and I realized that somewhere in the past weeks, without meaning to, I had begun to care for him. Not as a wife was supposed to care for a husband, dutifully and without question, but as one human being cares for another, with compassion, with understanding, with the fragile, tentative beginnings of love. I said, I would like that. He smiled then, a real smile, the first I had ever seen from him. It transformed his face, made him look younger, lighter, almost handsome, and I felt my own lips curve in response. We did not embrace. We did not kiss. We simply stood there in the morning light and acknowledged what we were beginning to build, a marriage that was not perfect. That was not what either of us had imagined, but that was ours, nonetheless. The weeks that followed were the happiest I had known since my parents' deaths. Julian and I fell into a rhythm that felt natural, easy. We took breakfast together and discussed the running of the estate. We walked in the gardens as winter deepened, watching the bare trees and the frost-covered ground and the gray sky that promised snow. We sat by the fire in the evenings, reading aloud to each other from novels and poetry, arguing good-naturedly about the merits of Dickens versus Thackeray, laughing at shared jokes that would have made no sense to anyone else. Julian began to smile more. The shadows beneath his eyes faded. He started to take an interest in the world beyond Greystone Manor, reading the newspapers, writing letters to colleagues at Cambridge, even traveling to the village to attend church on Sundays. Something Mrs. Garrick told me he had not done since Thomas's death, and I began to feel at home. I rearranged my rooms to suit my taste, bringing in fresh flowers despite the season, replacing the heavy drapes with lighter fabric, opening the windows to let in air and light. I took over the management of the household, working with Mrs. Garrick to hire additional staff, to repair what had fallen into disrepair, to make Greystone Manor feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home. I wrote to Aunt Catherine and told her that I had returned to my husband. She wrote back with terse approval, saying that I had finally come to my senses, but it was not sense that had brought me back. It was something else entirely, something I was only beginning to understand. One evening in late December, as we sat together in the library after supper, Julian set down his book and looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. He said, "Eleanor, may I ask you something?" "Of course," I said. He hesitated, then asked, "Why did you come back? After everything I told you, after seeing the projection, after understanding what I had done, why did you return to Greystone Manor? You could have walked away. You could have left me to my grief. No one would have blamed you." I considered his question carefully. It deserved an honest answer. I said, "I came back because I saw in you something I recognized in myself: loneliness, loss, the desperate need to hold on to something even when holding on was destroying us. I came back because I thought perhaps we could help each other. And because, Julian, beneath all the grief and the science and the impossibility of what you created, I saw a good man, a man worth knowing, worth saving." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You saved me. You know that, don't you? If you had not come back, if you had not stood with me in that laboratory and helped me let go, I would have lost myself entirely to that machine." "We saved each other," I said softly, "because you gave me something too. You gave me a home, a purpose, a reason to stop running from my own ghosts." He reached across the space between us and took my hand. His fingers were warm, his grip firm. He said, "I am falling in love with you, Eleanor. I did not expect it. I did not think I was capable of it after Thomas, but I am, and I need you to know that, even if you do not feel the same, even if this is simply a partnership built on mutual need. I need you to know that what I feel for you is real." My heart was pounding. I looked at him, at this brilliant, damaged, impossibly gentle man, and realized that I had been falling in love with him too, slowly, carefully, like learning to trust solid ground after years of walking on ice. I said, "I feel the same, Julian. I think I have for weeks now. I was just afraid to admit it, afraid that if I said it aloud, it would vanish like one of your projections." He stood and pulled me to my feet. And then, finally, after all the weeks of careful distance and polite restraint, he kissed me. It was tentative at first, gentle, as though he were afraid I might pull away. But I did not pull away. I leaned into him, my hands resting on his chest, and kissed him back. And in that moment, in the firelit library of Greystone Manor, we became not just husband and wife in name, but in truth, in heart. That night, for the first time, I did not sleep in my own room. I went with Julian to his chambers, and we lay together in the darkness, talking quietly about the future, about the life we would build, about the children we might have, the travels we might take, the years we might share. And when I finally fell asleep, it was in his arms, feeling safe and loved, and for the first time in my life, truly home. But even in the midst of happiness, there are shadows, and Greystone Manor, for all that we had begun to transform it, still held secrets, secrets that would not stay buried, secrets that, in the end, would demand their due. Spring came late to Greystone Manor that year, arriving in fits and starts, the cold reluctant to surrender its hold on the gray stone and frozen earth. But when it finally came, when the first green shoots pushed through the soil and the trees began to bud and the air lost its bitter edge, it felt like a resurrection. The house itself seemed to wake from a long sleep. Rooms that had been closed for years suddenly opened to light and air, gardens that had grown wild now tended and pruned, the silence that had pressed down on everything finally lifting. Julian and I had been married nearly 6 months. It was a true marriage now, in every sense. We shared a bed, shared our days, shared the small intimacies and larger dreams that bind two people together. I had come to know him in ways I never imagined during those first terrible days. I knew the way he took his tea, 2 sugars and a splash of milk. I knew that he read Latin poetry when he could not sleep. I knew the scar on his left hand from a childhood fall, the way his voice changed when he spoke of Thomas, softer and more gentle, as though his brother's memory deserved tenderness. I knew that he loved me. He told me so often, as though the words themselves were a kind of prayer. And I loved him. Not the careful, dutiful love I had imagined I might feel for a husband, but something deeper and more complicated. A love built on shared grief and hard-won trust. A love that had survived the impossible and emerged stronger for it. The components of the Vitascope remained in the laboratory, wrapped and stored in wooden crates. Julian had not been able to bring himself to destroy them entirely. They represented years of work, of brilliant and terrible innovation. But neither could he bear to have them in the house. So we had agreed, in the weeks after we dismantled the machine, that we would find another solution. We would donate them to Cambridge, to the Natural Philosophy Department, where Julian had studied, with strict instructions that they were to be used only for the advancement of optical science, never to be reassembled in their original configuration, never to be used to create another projection. In mid-April, a representative from the university came to collect the crates. Julian and I stood together in the laboratory as the man catalogued each component, making notes in a leather-bound journal, asking questions about the chemical processes and the arrangement of mirrors. Julian answered with the detached precision of a scholar, explaining the theory without revealing the purpose. When the man asked what the machine had been designed to do, Julian said simply that it had been an experiment in capturing and projecting light, an experiment that had ultimately failed. The man nodded and made his notes. He did not press for details. By afternoon, the crates were loaded onto a wagon and driven away down the long gravel drive. Julian and I watched from the window of the laboratory until they disappeared from view. Then we turned to each other, and without speaking, we embraced. It felt like an ending and a beginning. That evening, as we sat together in the library, Julian said, "There is something I need to tell you about my first wife." I had wondered about her, of course, the woman who had died in childbirth, whose memory hung over Greystone Manor like a veil. But I had never asked. It had seemed like prying, like opening a door that was meant to stay closed. Now, as Julian spoke, I set down my book and listened. "Her name was Catherine," he said. "We married when I was 25. It was an arrangement, like ours, though I knew her a bit better than I knew you when we wed. She was the daughter of a family friend. A quiet woman, sensible and kind. We were not in love, but we were fond of each other. We thought that would be enough." He paused, his gaze distant. "She became pregnant within the first year. She was so happy. She had always wanted children. But the pregnancy was difficult. She was ill from the start, weak and in pain. The doctors said it was normal, that it would pass, but it did not pass. It only worsened. And when the time came for the child to be born, she was already so frail, so exhausted, that her body could not bear it." His voice cracked slightly. "She died 3 days after the birth. The child, a son, lived only a few hours longer. I buried them together in the family chapel. And Thomas, who was still healthy then, sat with me through the funeral and told me that grief was not a thing to be ashamed of, that love, even love that ended in loss, was worth the pain." I reached out and took his hand. I said, "I am so sorry, Julian." He shook his head. "I blamed myself for a long time. I thought I should have done something, should have saved her, saved the child. But Thomas told me that some things are beyond our control, that death is part of life, and that the only dishonor is in refusing to go on living. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would not shut myself away, that I would find someone to love, that I would build a life. And then he died," I said quietly. "And you broke that promise." "Yes," Julian said. "I broke it. I shut myself away in the laboratory and tried to bring him back. I forgot Catherine. I forgot the promise. I forgot everything except my grief. Until you came. Until you forced me to remember that I was still alive, still capable of love." He looked at me, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You brought me back, Eleanor. You saved me from becoming a ghost myself, and I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of that gift, being worthy of you." I leaned forward and kissed him, gently, a promise of my own. "You are already worthy," I said. "You always were. You just could not see it." We sat together in the firelight, holding each other, and I felt the last shadow lift from Greystone Manor. Catherine and Thomas were gone, but they were at peace, and so, finally, were we. In May, I discovered I was pregnant. The realization came slowly. A growing awareness of changes in my body. A certain tenderness and fatigue that I recognized from watching other women in my life. I told Julian one morning at breakfast, simply and without ceremony, "We are going to have a child." He stared at me, his teacup frozen halfway to his lips. Then he set it down very carefully and said, "Are you certain?" "I am certain," I said. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday when he came to the village. He says I am perhaps 2 months along. The child will come in late autumn." Julian rose from his chair and came to me. He knelt beside me and took my hands, pressing them to his lips. His eyes were wet. "Eleanor," he whispered. "My God, Eleanor." I smoothed his hair, my own eyes stinging with tears. "Are you happy?" He laughed, a sound of pure, astonished joy. "Happy? I am terrified. I am overwhelmed. I am more grateful than I have words to express. Yes, Eleanor, I am happy." We held each other for a long time, there in the morning room, with the sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of birdsong drifting in from the garden. And I thought of Catherine, of the child she had carried and lost, of the tragedy that had marked Julian's first attempt at fatherhood. I sent up a silent prayer that this time would be different, that our child would be healthy and strong, that we would be given the chance to build the family Julian had lost. The pregnancy progressed well. I was healthy, if tired, and the village doctor assured Julian repeatedly that there was no cause for concern. But Julian worried nonetheless. He hovered, attentive and anxious, forbidding me from lifting anything heavy, from walking too far, from doing anything that might pose even the slightest risk. It was endearing and exasperating in equal measure. I told him more than once that I was not made of glass. He replied that I was carrying something infinitely precious, and he would not take chances. Mrs. Garrick, who had softened considerably toward me since my return, prepared a nursery in the west wing, a bright room with windows overlooking the garden. She and I spent hours selecting fabrics and furniture, discussing the practicalities of caring for an infant, sharing the quiet, timeless knowledge that women pass between themselves. She told me that she had been fond of Thomas, that he had been kind to her when her own husband died, that she was glad the house would have life in it again, that a child was exactly what Greystone Manor needed. In late June, on a warm evening when the garden was in full bloom, Julian asked me to walk with him to the chapel. We had not been there since Thomas's funeral, and I felt a flicker of apprehension as we approached. But Julian's hand was steady in mine, his expression calm. The chapel was small and simple, built of the same gray stone as the manor, with arched windows and a slate roof. Inside, it smelled of old wood and candle wax. Thomas's grave was in the churchyard behind the building, marked by a white marble headstone that bore his name and the dates of his brief life. Julian led me to it and stood for a moment in silence. Then he said, "Thomas, I want you to meet Eleanor, my wife, the woman who saved me, who brought me back to the living, who is carrying my child." His voice was steady, free of the raw grief that had once consumed him. He continued, "I know you would have liked her. She is strong and clever and kind. She does not suffer fools, which you would have appreciated. And she loves me, Thomas. God knows why, but she does. She sees all my flaws and failures and loves me anyway." He paused, and I felt tears slip down my cheeks. I reached out and placed my hand on the cool marble of the headstone. Julian said, "I am letting you go now, truly letting you go, not because I have forgotten you. I will never forget you, but because I have to live. I have a wife and a child on the way and a future that I want to embrace. You would want that for me. I know you would. So this is goodbye, Thomas. Rest well. I will carry you in my heart, always, but I will not let you keep me from living." We stood there together, Julian and I, in the warm evening air with the scent of roses drifting from the garden. And I felt something shift, a presence that had been hovering at the edges of Greystone Manor, finally releasing its hold. Thomas was gone. Not erased, not forgotten, but freed. And so were we. As we walked back to the house, Julian said, "Thank you for coming here with me, for bearing witness. I do not think I could have done that alone." I squeezed his hand. "You are not alone, Julian. You never will be again." The summer passed in a haze of contentment. I grew larger as the child grew within me, and Julian became more protective, more tender, more openly affectionate than I had ever imagined he could be. He read to me in the evenings, poetry and novels and scientific treatises that I did not always understand, but that he explained with such enthusiasm that I could not help but be charmed. He spoke to my swelling belly, telling the child stories about his Uncle Thomas, about the estate, about the world waiting beyond the walls of Greystone Manor. He made plans, dreamed aloud about the future, about teaching our child to ride and to read and to question everything, and I watched him transform. The man I had married, distant and grief-stricken and haunted, was gone. In his place was someone I had never expected to find, a partner, a lover, a friend. The man Julian had always been beneath the grief, warm and funny and deeply good, finally allowed to emerge. In October, as the leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp, I went into labor. It was a long and difficult process, painful in ways I had not anticipated, and there were moments when I was frightened, when I thought of Catherine and wondered if I too would be lost. But Julian was with me the entire time, holding my hand, wiping my forehead, speaking to me in a low, steady voice that kept me anchored. And Mrs. Garrick, who had attended many births in her long life, guided us through with calm competence. The child was born just before dawn, a healthy boy with dark hair and his father's gray eyes. Julian wept when he held him for the first time, cradling the tiny body against his chest with such careful reverence that my heart ached. He said, "Thank you, Eleanor, thank you." We named him Thomas Julian Blackwood. It felt right, a way of honoring the past while embracing the future. Julian's brother was gone, but his name would live on, and perhaps, in some small way, that was its own kind of immortality. The weeks after Thomas's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and the strange, overwhelming love that comes with caring for a new life. Julian was a devoted father, waking with me when the baby cried, walking the floors with him when he was fussy, staring at him with an expression of wonder that never seemed to fade. He told me, more than once, that he had not believed he would ever have this. A family, a son, a second chance. I told him that we had given each other second chances, that we had both been lost, both haunted, both trapped by the past, and that we had found a way forward together. One evening in late November, as we sat together in the nursery with Thomas asleep in his cradle, Julian said, "Do you ever think about that night? The night you saw the projection? The night you fled?" "I do," I said. "How could I not?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Do you regret it? Coming back?" I looked at him, at the man I had married in fear and come to love through choice. I said, "No, I do not regret it. Not for a moment. Because if I had not come back, if I had not faced the impossible and stood with you in that laboratory and helped you let go, we would not have this. We would not have each other. We would not have him." I gestured to the cradle, to the sleeping child who bore his uncle's name. Julian followed my gaze and smiled, a soft, private smile that was just for us. He said, "I used to believe that science could solve everything, that with enough knowledge, enough precision, enough control, I could bend the world to my will. I thought I could defeat death, preserve what was lost, make the impossible real. And, I asked, and I was wrong," he said. "Some things cannot be controlled. Some things cannot be saved. Death is part of life. Loss is part of love. And the only way forward is to accept that, to let go, to choose the living over the dead." He reached out and took my hand. "You taught me that, Eleanor. You taught me that love is not about holding on. It is about letting go, about trusting that even when we lose what we cherish most, we can find something new to cherish, something just as precious." I leaned my head against his shoulder. "And you taught me that I am not alone, that even in the darkest places, even when everything seems impossible, there is hope, there is light, there is a future worth fighting for." We sat together in the quiet nursery, listening to the soft sounds of our son's breathing, and I felt a peace I had never known. Greystone Manor was no longer a place of death and shadows. It was a home, a place where the past was honored but not worshipped, a place where love had triumphed over grief, a place where, against all odds, two broken people had found a way to heal each other. Years passed. Thomas grew into a bright, curious child who loved nothing more than exploring the grounds with his father, asking endless questions about plants and animals and the way light bent through water. Julian, though he never returned to his experiments with projections, continued his work in optics, publishing papers that were well received by his peers. He taught at Cambridge occasionally, traveling to the university for a few weeks each year while I managed the estate. We had two more children, a daughter we named Catherine for Julian's first wife, and another son we called William for my father. The house rang with their voices, their laughter, their arguments and games. The silence that had once filled Greystone Manor was banished forever, replaced by the joyful chaos of family life. Aunt Catherine came to visit often, her disapproval softening into grudging affection. She told me, on one of her visits, that she had been wrong about Julian, that he was a good man, that I had been fortunate in the end to marry him. I did not tell her about the vitascope, about the projection, about the impossible thing my husband had created. Some secrets were meant to be kept. Some stories were too strange to share. On the 10th anniversary of our wedding, Julian and I returned to the chapel. The children were with Mrs. Garrick, who had become as much grandmother as housekeeper to them. We stood together at Thomas's grave, now weathered and softened by time, moss growing at the edges of the stone. Julian said, "I think about him still, every day, but it does not hurt the way it once did. The grief is still there, but it is gentle now, a sweet ache rather than a wound." I slipped my arm through his. "That is as it should be. Love does not end with death. It simply changes." He looked down at me, his eyes warm, "And we carry it forward, into the future, into the lives we build." "Yes," I said, "we carry it forward." We walked back to the house together, through the garden that bloomed now with roses and lavender and the flowers I had planted over the years. The manor stood before us, no longer gray and forbidding, but golden in the afternoon light. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Voices drifted from the open windows. This was home. This was life. This was the impossible thing we had built from grief and science and desperate, stubborn hope. Julian paused at the door and turned to me. He said, "Thank you, Eleanor, for everything, for saving me, for loving me, for giving me this life." I rose on my toes and kissed him. "And thank you," I said, "for letting me save you, for being worth saving, for showing me that even the most impossible things can become real if we are brave enough to believe in them." We walked inside, into the warmth and light and noise of our family, leaving the past where it belonged, behind us, at rest, no longer haunting us, but simply a part of the story that had brought us here, to this moment, to this love, to this life we had built from ashes and shadows and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other. I married a man I had never truly seen. I fled him on our wedding night because I witnessed the impossible, but I returned. I chose him. I chose us. And in the end, that choice was the most important one I ever made. Because love, I learned, is not about perfection. It is not about certainty or control or the absence of fear. It is about standing beside someone in the darkness and refusing to let go. It is about witnessing their pain and their brilliance and their impossible grief and choosing them anyway. It is about building something new from the ruins of what was lost. Julian and I built that new thing together. And it was real. It was solid. It was ours. And it was more than enough.